It was the summer of 2013 on the last weekend before classes. My family decided that a trip to Six Flags would be nice. My mom let me go on my own since my brother didn't want to go with me. They just told me to meet them at the main plaza at 7 p.m. I went to almost all the rides, and when I was about to ride this 5-seater roller coaster, nobody was in my lane. So I was alone. Then a bunch of 14 or 15-year-old guys lined up on my lane, and I was stuck there, being the only girl. At first I was completely fine with that. They weren't doing anything to me, but I was getting paranoid because they were nudging and whispering to each other, then glancing at me. When we were boarding the platform, they chose both sides, and I was stuck in the middle. Here is the arrangement from left to right. Dude number 1, dude number 2, me, dude number 3, and dude number 4. And then when the ride started and nobody could back out anymore, I felt 2 hands groping my legs. I jolted and I looked at them, but they were smirking.
"Enjoy the ride, girl."
At this point, I'm completely freaking out. I was looking forward for the ride to end. Minutes seemed like hours. The guy on my right kept his hand on my legs, and the one on my right was staring at me and occasionally winking at me, and I did not have the guts to tell him otherwise. God knows what else they could do. At the end of the ride, I bolted and ran for the exit. I heard their footsteps too, and I went to the nearest safest place I could find, which was the restroom. I was panting and heaving hard, and I stalled for a few minutes and peered out to see if they had followed me. I saw them looking at the door, and they caught me looking at them. This time I was really afraid because they have more friends with them. They are now 10 to 15 in all. I didn't know what to do, so I just called my mom to pick me up at the restroom, and I told her the reason why. And minutes later, she was at the door. We walked out and I saw they weren't there anymore. So creepy perverts at Six Flags. Let's not meet again. I'm using a throwaway type of account for this. Basically, I want to protect the anonymity of my daughter. My daughter is 13, and she and her friend were allowed to go off on their own at a really large amusement park, a couple of hours from where we live. I did not have a problem with that. The parents she was with were with people that I trust, and they are all good kids that she was going off with, so I did not think that anything could happen to her. I was wrong. She met a boy there. He told her that he was 16 or so, and they, him, her, and 2 other girls, started to hang out for the day. He immediately attached himself to her, getting friendly and flattering her. She thought he was cute, so everything was good in her mind. As the day progressed, he started to encourage her to stay at the park instead of go home with her friends and their family. She says that no, she cannot because we are 2 hours away and cannot come get her. He persists, and when she refuses, he wants her to come the following weekend and meet with him alone. She comes home and tells us about this kid, and really, we did not think that much about it until we realized a few things. 1. He was at the park completely alone. I've been to that park many times and have never seen someone obviously alone there. People always have someone with them, especially a teenage boy. We have no doubt that he would have been there with an adult watching him and waiting to see who he can lure away. 2. He did not have a cell phone, a Facebook account, email, or anything else of that nature. In fact, he had her create him a Facebook account so they could keep in touch using her own email address. 3. She snapped a photo of him and he is not 16. I would say more in his early 20s. 4. He did everything that he could to convince her to leave her friends, stay late at the park, and go alone with him the next weekend. 5. He said everything exactly right. He had her thinking. They had as good as a connection as she had with their previous relationship. That was with someone who ended up becoming her best friend while they were together. 6. The kid was from one of the Eastern Bloc countries. He did not have an accent, but if she called his house, whoever answered had a very thick accent and spoke in Russian or some similar language. Additionally, it was always a male that answered the phone, and male voices can be heard in the background. 7. He lied to her about things in order to have her feel connected to him. I cannot give specific details here. In the end, we are very confident that he was a recruiter for sex slavery, or something of that nature. I'm not being a paranoid parent here. I know that it sounds like it is, but I'm not the type to be really worried. My daughter is 13 and has looked 16 for a couple of years already. She blossomed early and has an hourglass figure. She is very attractive. The guy almost completely ignored her friends. One is pretty but a big girl, and the other is tiny, cute enough in her own way. Everything points to the fact that I could have lost my daughter that day if she did not have a good head on her shoulders. If she had gone with him, I have no doubt that I would have never seen her again.
My name is Abby, and I work in the happiest place on earth. Well, properly, I work in the Starbucks in the middle of Epcot. Day in and day out, I get to deal with impatient rabid Disney families and the occasional college students dying to get their caffeine fixes. And all the while, I get to do with the energy of a Disney princess moonlighting as a barista. It's not terrible, but trying to keep a cheery smile on my face and a certain pep in my step gets difficult sometimes, especially lately. You see, I'm one of the newest hirees here, so I get tasked with all the worst jobs, like running the huge bags of latte-saturated trash to the underground trash compactor, opening most days and closing most others, and the occasional odd job. What would turn out to be one of the scariest days of my life started like this, as an odd job. I dreaded it, sure, but it was innocent enough, right? The job was unusual right away, since it wasn't in my area. Hell, it wasn't even in Epcot at all. Back in the day, Disney used to operate a water park called River Country. Some of you will undoubtedly remember it fondly, as you should. The whole idea of the place was that it was supposed to look natural, so they built a bunch of realistic-looking rock formations and try to blend it into the wildlife as much as possible. They took the theme even farther by connecting the pools to the adjacent Bay Lake, basically damming it off. The bottoms of the pools were sandy like a natural body of water, and the water was all filtered from the lake. It was a genius idea, and the park was a success ever since it opened in the 1970s. In 2001, the park closed for good. Disney gave a lot of reasons why, but the real one was simple. They had a death on their conscience. Growing up in Florida like me, you hear a lot of talk of the brain-eating bacteria that live in the water. These are Naegleria flori, bacteria that live in warm, fresh water. They can get into your brain through your nose and cause a fatal infection. Here in Florida, a kid will die of it every 10 years or so, and it'll be all over the news. Of course, it doesn't put you off jumping into the lakes and rivers. Your parents just tell you to hold your nose shut like all the other kids, and bam, no Naegleria fowleri for you. As it turns out, Disney's filtration system wasn't enough to get everything out. The water in River Country pumped in from the Bay Lake, and and was contaminated with Naegleria fowleri. It took the life of an 11-year-old boy. After the fatal flaw of River Country's design was uncovered, it was shut down. Rather than demolish it, Disney decided to abandon it. Everything still stands today, intact and eerie, slowly but surely being overtaken by nature. How do I play into this? Well, as if the story of River Country isn't foreboding enough, all the lights and music still run at the place. I've heard a lot of reasons for it. Everything from preserving the remaining magic to the notion that the light and sound system is shared with some of the resorts. Whatever the reason, someone has to go out and change those light bulbs when they go out. Last night, one went out, and that lucky soul that was to replace it was yours truly. It certainly wasn't an assignment worth protesting, but I also wasn't looking forward to it. With the latest marathon running through the parks, the day was swamped. By the time I was able to grab the light bulb and trek out to River Country, it was twilight, and my shift was nearly over. It was a real shock moving from all the laughter and smiles and exuberance that encompasses all the rest of Disney to this place of dead silence and emptiness. The place lived up to its expectations at first. Nature had made some serious progress, and on taking everything over, the water was murky and green, calm at the surface, but with God knows what beneath. Branches began to grow over the water slides. The beach area was no more. A sign stood at the entrance, cheerfully announcing the park was to close. The light bulb I was to change was located past the employee area, at the back of the park. As I walked, I kicked aside branches, brambles, and occasionally yellow tickets, nearly ground into the dust by now. A stray inner tube sat off on my right in the woods, covered in pollen and mostly deflated. By now, the sun was drawing close to the horizon. If I didn't get the job done soon, visibility would become an issue. I picked up my pace, but couldn't help but shiver as I sped past the pool where that boy had caught his fatal infection. I was starting to grow uneasy, and it was starting to affect me. Every time I turned around, I would see a shadow. At first, it just looked like people, then children, then Disney characters. I swear I saw a familiar mouse staring out at me from deep in the trees, but it was too dark to tell. But my mind had been playing tricks on me, right? Finally, I reached the employee hut. As I walked beyond it, I saw a glimpse of color behind the dusty window. Stopping dead, my heart starting to race. I debated turning around. The wind was picking up, and leaves were rustling all around me. Goosebumps rose up all over my skin. I decided against it, and sped walked to the only dark light bulb on the property. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, the previously dead light bulb began to flicker. My heart nearly stopped, but I stepped forward anyways. Now, the light turned on and stayed bright. I took another few steps, then stopped in my tracks. Now, all the rest of the lights in the park were flickering. In shock and fear, I dropped the light bulb I'd been carrying, and it shattered on the ground. As the hairs on my back and my neck rose, I swear I heard something. And don't laugh, but damn it, if it didn't sound like Goofy in the background, then I don't know. It sounds insane, but when you spend as much time around the characters as I do, I know the voice, and I know his laugh. I would have recognized it anywhere, and I heard it, echoing throughout the place. The next second, all I could hear was my breath as I turned and ran. I tried to stop myself from looking through the window as I raced, but I couldn't. And what I saw haunts me to this day. Goofy was behind the glass, dressed in his silly swimsuit with his inner tube. Thick maroon blood was dried all over his black and white outfit, caked in his fur. Moss covered part of him, dust the rest. The employee hut was filling with water as he stood there, banging on the glass, smiling a wicked smile. I can still hear the sick thumping sound of his fists on the window when I try to sleep. I could see the fur on Goofy's costume getting wet, see the water starting to turn red, see the movement that meant he was anything but animatronic. Just as I realized how real he was, the glass window shattered and the foul lake water spilled out. Goofy stood there, laughing and laughing, starting to crawl through the window. I turned to run, but I felt cold, slimy hands on my shoulders, holding me back. Whispers were coming from all around me, including from my own head. The next thing I knew, my head hit the ground. When I came to, it was pitch black, and I was sitting in the first aid area of Epcot, surrounded by coworkers. Of course, they wouldn't tell me anything. Heat exhaustion, they said. Passed out at River Country, they said. Found by maintenance, they said. But I knew what I had seen. I could hear the laugh ringing in my ears and feel the sticky, toxic lake water fermenting on my work clothes. I could still feel the clammy hands on my skin. Please believe me, no one else does, and I have to go to work soon. My name is Abby, and I'm scared of what else the mouse might have in store for me. I'm sorry for the semi-long introduction, but I feel it's necessary to explain where I stand in my job is not to confuse you later. As you can obviously tell by the title, I work in an amusement park for a living. I can't disclose the name or pinpoint the location of the park, as it will definitely get me fired. All I can say is that the park is located in the US and attracts a fairly large amount of traffic, mainly during the early hours of the day. Though I'm planning to quit, hopefully as soon as possible, I can't financially afford to be fired as of right now. The park pays quite handsomely, and working there includes more benefits than any other place I've ever dreamed of. My uncle had close connections with one of the higher-ups in the park's management, so about 2 years ago, he was able to score me a place at the park. I hastily accepted this position, as there aren't many high-paying jobs available for students fresh out of college. My first job position had started out as a ride operator, but over time, my uncle relayed to his connection that I could and should be volunteering for an extra job in the park. Little things like filing in for absentees for the day were the jobs that sprung up often. That's when stuff started to go down. I saw the strangest, most terrifying and awful things in that park. That's why I'm here. I'm going to expose to you the most gritty and unexplained events that I've ever experienced firsthand. When I started off solely as a ride operator, I was always told that the safety of the employees, as well as the customers, was top priority. I had no real qualms about this for a few months while I was just beginning work at my own operating station. But one night, after hours, one of my coworkers, Marley, and I were chatting very close to the ride she usually worked around. We technically weren't supposed to be in that realm of the park at this time, but we had taken some extra time cleaning up around Marley's booth. We were just talking casually before Marley suddenly stiffened up and her head snapped to where the ride sat, looming and static in the night. Her eyes were wild and had this strange glow to it. I couldn't place what was truly off about her. "Would you please go up there and turn on the ride for me?" "Are you insane? Someone's gonna notice the gargantuan ride swinging about in the middle of the park." "Just do it, pretty please," she said this through gritted teeth, obviously annoyed. I grumbled, but made my way to the control panel to turn on the ride. The ride in question was once located in the kiddie portion of the park. It was mostly shaded by woods and was relatively small. It was no roller coaster, but it attracted a good amount of attention by our myriad of clients. A red and yellow spinning saucer-type disc sat in the middle of a curved blue cradle. When the ride was on, the saucer would spin as it went up, and down across the cradle. It's hard to explain, but I hope the description helped at least a little bit. When I turned it on, Marley just stared at the saucer as it swung back and forth. Then she jumped the fence, separating her from the ride. I screamed Marley's name and told her to get out of there. This was so extremely dangerous, since the ride was backed up to the fence so much. Only about 10 feet of space separated them. As I switched off the ride and strung 4-lettered words together, Marley, still in trace with the saucer, yelled something. All I could hear was the phrase, "Give me Caroline!" As the ride just began to slow, Marley inched closer. Closer. She got so close. The wind generated by its swinging tousled her hair wildly. Her golden brown eyes still fixated on the yellow and red striped disc. Marley flung herself into the ride's path. The ride belunged on her. The disc swung into her, tossing her body 30 feet to the other side of the ride before she hit the ground with a sound like that of a sack of potatoes. Blood and entrails spraying everywhere all over the ride and on the concrete sidewalk of the wait line. I heard screaming from the distance, like nothing I'd ever heard before, and realized sometime later that it was me who I was hearing. Within minutes, 2 of the park's managers approached the ride. One shook his head and mumbled something along the lines of, "Another one." There was no sadness or sheer terror. No emotion whatsoever in his voice. And instead of fussing over Marley, both men started fussing over me. "It's okay. It happens sometimes. She's fine." "Shh." They wrapped me in a blanket that they all conveniently had on hand and pet my hair, which I found really creepy, even at the time. It took me near an hour to get to the point where I stopped screaming and crying profusely. It was then when I noticed that the police hadn't shown up. Neither had an ambulance. Only a bored-looking janitor, sporting a stained trash cart, showed up and dropped the body into it with a thump. It was awful. When I tried to explain what had happened, the managers just shook their heads and feigned grief and remorse when saying, "Yeah, we know, it happens sometimes." They basically sat with me for hours, having me confirm I wouldn't disclose the minor accident to anyone and promote chaos among our visitors. Overall, they were acting so calm and suspicious, as if this had happened at least 100 times before. The next night, as my mind relayed what had happened, I realized that my large salary didn't come free. I was being paid to keep my mouth shut about the terrible things that went on. This happened back when I was around 14 years old, when my parents took myself, my little sister, and my best friend on a day trip to the amusement park, Kings Island. My friend, myself, and my sister split up from my parents with instructions to meet near the entrance at closing time. We spent the whole day riding rides and doing all the fun activities that the park had to offer. My sister, who was only 10 years old at the time, was afraid to ride any of the roller coasters. So naturally, my friend and I spent the day trying to get her to let go of her fear and ride one. It was getting late, and it was almost time to head towards the entrance to meet up with my parents. It was at that time my sister finally got brave enough and agreed to ride this smaller roller coaster called the Adventure Express. Since the park was getting ready to close, the line was short. My sister got on next to my friend, and I was stuck riding in the seat behind them, next to some weird guy, who gave me a creepy smile as we loaded onto the ride. The guy looked in about his 30s, but the one thing that stood out about him was that he had a blue bandana tied around his right hand. I thought that maybe he had injured his hand or something, and didn't think twice about it. Once we hit the first hill of the roller coaster, I glanced over, and this guy had his penis out. It was jerking off, right next to me on the freaking roller coaster ride. I was horrified. All I remember was staring straight ahead, with all the blood drained from my face in shock and horror. My sister and friend were having a good old time and kept looking back at me, laughing and smiling, not knowing what was going on right next to me. When the ride stopped, the guy zipped up his pants, jumped off the ride, and slipped away into the park. I was so scared and shocked that I didn't tell my parents. I just couldn't believe what had happened. I will never ride a roller coaster next to a stranger ever again in my life.